When you open up the New Testament, you don't just get one story about Jesus, you get four: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And while they all tell the same basic story, the way they tell it can be, well, dramatically different. It's a fascinating puzzle, really. And to see what I mean, let's start with a really stark example.
Okay, let's zoom in on the arrest of Jesus. If you read Mark's gospel, you get this incredibly raw human moment. Jesus is on the ground, literally begging God to let this cup pass from him, and his friends, they all run away. But then you flip over to John's account, and it's a totally different scene. A whole troop of soldiers, we're talking up to 600, shows up, and they're the ones who end up on the ground. Jesus is in complete command, basically telling them who they can and can't arrest. Same event, but wow, two completely different feelings, two different portraits of Jesus.
So, what gives? Are these just flat-out contradictions? Did somebody get the story wrong? Or is there something deeper, something more intentional going on here? To even begin to solve this puzzle, we've got to start with a really basic question. What even is a gospel?
Well, a huge piece of the puzzle is that the word gospel doesn't mean biography, not at all. It comes from the Greek word euangelion, which literally means good news. It's an announcement, a proclamation. And right away, that tells you something crucial. The authors weren't just trying to be historians, meticulously recording facts. They were trying to announce something world-changing.
As historian Paula Fredrickson puts it so well, the Gospels are kind of like a religious advertisement. Each author is carefully shaping their story of Jesus to persuade a particular audience about a very specific message. They aren't trying to be neutral reporters. They're evangelists, proclaiming what they believe is the most important news in the world. So let's be super clear here. We're not talking about a court transcript or a live news report. What we have are theological reflections. Think of the authors as artists and theologians, carefully selecting their materials and arranging them to paint a powerful, meaningful picture of who Jesus was and why he mattered. Okay, so if these are theological reflections and not just eyewitness reports, that brings up a really big question, doesn't it? Who were these artists? Who actually wrote these books? And well, this is where the plot thickens. For hundreds and hundreds of years, the traditional answer was pretty straightforward. The church said Matthew and John were apostles, actual eyewitnesses to the events. Mark was the interpreter for the Apostle Peter, writing down his memories. And Luke was a doctor who traveled with the Apostle Paul. But a lot of modern scholars have a different take on it. They suggest that the Gospels were originally written and circulated anonymously, and then later, maybe 100 years later, the names we know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were attached to them to give them more authority, to give them that direct link back to the apostles. And you can see exactly why this debate is even a thing when you look at the timeline. Jesus' life is around 30 CE, the Gospels themselves get written somewhere between 70 and 95 CE, but our oldest copies that actually have the titles, the Gospel according to Matthew, they don't show up until around the year 200. It's in that long gap that some scholars think the names might have been added. But, and this is a huge but, there's a major catch. For that theory to hold water, you'd expect to find some of those early anonymous copies, right? The thing is, we've never, ever found one. Not a single ancient copy of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John has turned up without a title. Every manuscript we have points to the same traditional author.
Okay, so this leads us to another really fascinating layer of this puzzle. Let's put John on the shelf for a second and just look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're so similar, it's uncanny. Sometimes they use the exact same Greek words in the exact same order. That's why they're called the Synoptic Gospels. It's Greek for seeing together. But they also have their own unique stories. So how can they be so alike and yet so different? This is a famous literary mystery called the synoptic problem.
The most popular explanation is something called the two-source hypothesis. Let's break it down. 1, most scholars agree that Mark wrote his gospel first, around 70 CE. 2, Matthew and Luke both got their hands on a copy of Mark and used it as the basic skeleton for their own stories. That explains the overlap. But what about all the stuff they share that isn't in Mark? Well, that's point number 3. Scholars think they also used a second, now lost source, basically a collection of Jesus' sayings that they call Q. And finally, 4, each author then stirred in their own unique material, stories only they tell. So when you step back and look at all the pieces we've just laid out, what a gospel is, who might have written them, how they relate to each other, you start to see this really beautiful, elegant solution. The Gospels aren't 4 competing historical records trying to outfact each other. A much better way to think about them is as 4 different portraits of the very same person.
Exactly.
Imagine 4 different artists are asked to paint a portrait of the same person. Each one is going to make different choices to capture what they see as that person's true essence. And that's what the gospel writers do. Matthew paints Jesus as the new Moses, the one who fulfills the whole story of the Old Testament. Mark shows us a surprising, suffering Messiah, whose power is hidden in weakness. Luke's portrait is of a savior for everyone, especially the poor and the outsiders. And John gives us this cosmic, divine Son of God, God in human flesh.
So there you have it, the gospel puzzle. Kind of solved, right? The differences aren't a problem to be fixed. They're the whole point. Once you realize the Gospels are good news, not just biographies, that their goal is to persuade you, and that the differences are just the deliberate brushstrokes of 4 brilliant artists, the whole thing just clicks into place. Each one is painting a unique and powerful portrait of Jesus for their community. And all of this leaves us with a really important final thought. If we stop seeing the Gospels as just history books and start seeing them as these rich, theological portraits, it doesn't make them less true. It actually reveals their incredible depth. It pushes us to ask not just, so what happened, but the more important question, so what does it all mean? And how does having these 4 incredible, distinct portraits change how we might see Jesus and his message for our world today?